Wi-Fi hookup, that's Ethernet, and a service that wasn't available in our older little portable Wi-Fi thingy. Finally came available, and we've upgraded because my system was bumping into too many things, trying to access too much and downloading too much over the things. And so anyway, hopefully we'll have resolved that point. Behold our hardly legible group of patrons to the project who have helped us. And it means all the difference in the world, I can tell you. So we're continuing with the exciting world of Nathaniel Jeanson's slippery little bibliography. It's still really sparse on the source space, and it's getting even more clumsy as we move into this next section that we'll be dealing with here. Also, I'm putting in a little link to a little bit from Erica Gutsick Gibbon, because that's a part that I've been investigating quite a chunk of this week, following up on her material. She did a video on whether or not Darwinism is responsible for the Holocaust and the Nazis. And there's a new creationist video that's come out on that. And I was doing, that's a topic that's going to be coming up in volume 2 where the rocks were there. So I was following up on the material that was being argued and the little authority quotes that were being presented, some of which I was familiar with, but a lot that actually I wasn't. And it involved diving in much more into the background of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who is a social Darwinist, who is an anti-Darwinist. He didn't. It sounds actually in some of his material, he sounds suspiciously similar to a lot of intelligent design thinkers. But anyway, all that's going to be put in the new volume, and I'll be putting a link then to at least to Erica's video so that you can see the raw stuff that is going to be put into the gist of it. But back to good old Jeanson. And part 2, which will be on some Permian trackways. So let's get a little blib about the Permian trackways part. Part 2, part 1. Piltdown Superman, who is a young Earth creationist, that's his Twitter handle, pounced on an ICR post from Frank Sherwin, Fossil Amphibian Footprints. Boop, 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 like so. And I'll be putting a link in on that one. And it drew on a brand new paper, which fortunately is open access because it's +1, on some new Permian trackways. And I'll be putting a link in for that little puppy. And two things come to mind about this whole process that's going on. First of all Sherwin had to offer on this was the mantra that they can't be 250 million years old. Permian period predates the dinosaurs. And that they must come from the Big Slosh. Never mind that the Permian is the Karoo Formation is actually kind of an arid desert. It's in the Pangea. It's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on. But point number 2 is what's missing from Sherwin. Where's the creationist baraminology? Where's all the creationist work explaining what these critters were within the creationist framework? Now, spoiler alert, the Ark Encounter has these sort of critters listed as family groups in the Ark Encounter because they got to be on the Ark. But that's also bringing up the whole issue of why they try to distance them from the mammals and how are they subdividing them, and what is all the biogeography of things in relation to, was the pre-flood environment Rodinia or Pangea? What exactly was going on in here? Why don't we put up detailed maps and things? The reason why is because they haven't a clue. They're just guessing. And some of them go with a Rodinia supercontinent. Some of them just do cartoons. Andrew Snelling has done that kind of thing that doesn't seem to have any relation with any actual geology. And for a geologist, that's pretty pathetic. So that one's going to be a really funky one to do because you'll be able to compare Sherwin's glib little post with the meticulous detail that's in the paper that he's not really discussing from afar. So that hopefully will be a little bit fun time for you. And it's going to be alluded to in relation to the big kinds list analysis that's going into part 2 of volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. Now, back to dear old Jeanson. Last week, you may recall there were a couple haplotypes that related to Jewish populations around the planet that he was making big deals about. And one of them is labeled kind of L in Jeanson's creationist framework. There's actually much more detail on that in the technical paper that I alluded to last week, and you can check that out at your leisure. But he now dangles the other half of this stuff, and it's the L node, and in the Mendez paper, which is coming around 7,600 years ago in that analysis. But Jeanson dragged it down to 1900 BCE-ish period, which is considerably later, and cites as corroboration a 2013 paper by D. Cristofaro. He's actually got a couple of that author's papers in his reference bibliography, and so I don't know one that's relating to Corsican genetics, and presumably later on in the book he's going to get around to that. We'll deal with it as we go. Anyway, the bulk of that work related to sorting out the genes of much more recent interaction. So it actually does fall in the period that's at the time of the Assyrians and other areas. So we're talking about 1000 BC on for the bulk of the paper. And I think that's why he decided to pick on it, because it at least drops into the framework of the young Earth creationist model. But in order to get there, he had to step over the beginning of the paper. And the paper had noted that, quote, the earliest archaeological evidence of modern humans in the area dates back some 30,000 years, unquote, with urban cultures in the region by late in the third millennium BCE. And he cited quite a few technical works on that, some books and others. Two that are open access, I'm going to be putting a link to. One is from 2005 by Ali on the survey of District Chitral, 2004, that breaks down a lot of the material going into the archaeology of the area. Every scrap of that would have to be somehow wiggle-woggled to fit into the young Earth creationist framework. And we're not getting anything of that from Jeanson. The other one is Freschetti 2012, which is about multi-regional emergence of mobile pastoralism, and looking at the cultural byproducts and what kind of societies are moving around in there in terms of this pastoral element versus non-pastoral, and that this is built on the archaeological framework. And of course, there's absolutely no allusion in any of that, or in the Di Cristofaro paper, on anything relating to the Big Slosh timeframe. Which would be 2350 BCE. There should have been a cataclysmic obliteration of all cultures previous to that. And then everything that occurs after that should be spreading out from Noah's and the family. And so shouldn't everything be related to the culture that Noah and the family had, in terms of if they had a written language? If not, when are they coming up with that? What about the home building styles? What about the gods and artwork and all the rest that's going on? What we don't see is, in fact, a homogeneous continuity following a cataclysmic obliteration of previous cultures. And you will look far and wide all across the young Earth creationist literature to try to see anybody that approaches that problem from that level. Let's build up our data field and find out what the facts are, and show that in fact fits in with this pre-flood culture, and what restrictions there would be on it. You're facing exactly the same problem as I mentioned last week in relation to Hugh Ross and his attempt to have a flood occurring 50,000 years ago or somewhere. But in order to do that and keep it fitting in with the biblical cartoon, he's got to have all the human population existing in just one little area that can be flooded, and which he doesn't go into any detail as to where the hell that is or how that would relate to anything. So all of this information is going to be a problem for anybody that's attempting to do other than what the historical scholarship suggests, which is that the biblical story of the flood is a retelling of the stories of the flood tales in Mesopotamia that came about because the Tigris-Euphrates river system would have flooded periodically, catastrophically, washing away cities and being a general nuisance. That the environment was not one that was conducive to really easy flood control. In fact, to some extent, the Chinese seem to be a little bit farther down the road in that area. And their flood tale, as we'll be going into in volume 2 of the Rocks Were There, is actually about flood control procedures on, I think, the Yellow River. That doesn't relate to a global cataclysm, and it's a bureaucratic failure from their point of view. So all of this attempt to try to save the data, to make it be accurate in a way that's not just an echo of Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh and Atrahasis and the various other versions of the biblical flood tales, is never going to go anywhere. And decades of attempts to make it go anywhere by various apologists have not gone anywhere. But it's funky to see them try. And so we still get that aspect in the affair in relation to them trying to latch on to legends of flood tales around the world. And there will be a very massive appendix in our new book that will be going into the ups and downs and the misrepresentations of these flood tales and the just superficial secondary scholarship that goes into this. So that kind of gets you up to speed on that angle of it. Another little funky thing that happened in this section of Snelling, of Jeanson's book, is that later in the section, Jeanson claims, quote, "The geologic record indicates that the pre-flood environment was dramatically different from the post-flood environment," unquote. That's the mantra. And who does he cite for it? Snelling's 2009 book, Earth's Catastrophic Past. But as viewers of this channel will know, and anybody that has tried to fact check Andrew Snelling will know, Snelling is not a play fair with the facts sort of guy. And the idea that he would be the source that you would rely on to document the veracity of the geologic column matching the Big Slosh is a problem right off the bat. But even more interesting, Snelling's book, by the way, was cited in Jeanson's previous book. And I think this is where things get funky. Because when you look in the reference bibliography of Jeanson's new book, Snelling's 2009 book isn't there. He forgot to put it in the reference bibliography. And so now that raises the interesting little prospect of how many more sources will he be alluding to in the course of the story that he forgets to put in the reference bibliography. And conversely, given how I've been seeing this massive pileup of sources that are in the reference bibliography, but he hasn't cited them yet. And the book's coming along. We're getting farther and farther. So either there's going to be a complete order of magnitude shift upwards in terms of the material, or what I'm suspecting, because I'm not trying to play spoiler alert here and look at the end of the book like you would the mystery to find out who done it. The only logical possibility is that in the appendices that he has at the end of the book that occupy quite a chunk, that's where all these remaining sources are going to be brought up. We'll find out. And by the time we get down to the end of the thing, we'll see just exactly how well it balances up. It's still only going to be, it's still averaging all told, even if he has quite a few sources that he forgets to put in the reference bibliography. It's not going to bring it up much. It's still at a level that's only around one source per page on average. And most of the pages in the chapter, in fact, don't have any references at all. It's basically a retreading of the argument that he's presented in his more recent technical stuff at Answers Research Journal, and I think a couple of them from the Journal of Creation, but mainly the Answers Research Journal. So we'll be finding out how far all of that's going to be going in due course. He's also gone a remarkably far way down the book without really paying a hell of a lot of attention to his little color plates and the like. The one that he did this time, it turned out, I'll give you a little peek of what the chart that he showed the last time in relation. There's his L and the T and L haplotype groups that related to the discussion from last week. At the bottom of the page is the next chart he fiddles with, which is the distribution of this little L group that he brings in the Afghans because the Afghans, or at least some parts of them, have a legend that they were related to Abraham. There's a certain population sector in the Afghan culture that has that viewpoint. So naturally, he latches onto that. I think he cites a Britannica bit. Hello, purple rhymes with orange. Greetings, sentient beings. Here we are now on the exciting world of a 4 and 5G Ethernet direct connection to a much more powerful internet web service that I would have bought it before, because it's actually only $5 more a month than the old Wi-Fi system that I was making use of, but it wasn't available yet because they have better knit blankets. Yes. Yes. Which bringing up blankets and others in artifacts and stuff is really a fascinating area, because that whole realm, it's hard to think offhand of a anti-evolutionist who is a working archaeologist, just as it's difficult to find, not impossible, but difficult to find one that is a paleontologist, and a working one is even rarer. So you've got a lot of disciplines in there that are relatively missing. And so when a creationist tries to dive into this area, and for all practical purposes, it's really only young earth creationists who are going to be sticking into this area, because when Ross brings up the stuff in the OEC department, he's not really diving into much of anything. So the the intelligent design movement doesn't pay attention to this at all. The young earth creationists have, in principle, a need to be able to go into all this archaeological literature and document meticulously how beautifully it fits the Big Slosh model. And the only snag in that would be that the data doesn't fit the Big Slosh model. And so it's going to be really frustrating for them if they try to do that. So the best they would be able to do is to try to cherry pick little blips of information. We'll be alluding to a variety of archaeological matters. L YEC is going to be brought up in the new book, and also Göbekli Tepe, that the creationists just, the ideological position for the small group that have even bumped into this issue is that Göbekli Tepe can't be as old as the archaeologists insist it is. So this is a matter of that they've just got to pick it all up and move it down past the Tower of Babel to bring it in, because it's too sophisticated in their view to warrant it being 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. And of course, the Earth isn't even that old, so they've got to junk the dating of it. But the problem is that then all of this connects up with all the other archaeological work, because an archaeological dig is more than just doing a little thermoluminescence test or something to try to date that particular area, or radiocarbon dating charcoal or something like that, which does come into it. But you've got the various artifacts going on. So you have the distinctive styles of pots, if they have those, or ornaments, or the way that they make their particular kinds of weaponry. Yes, yeah, usually, exactly. That's another ironic bit about what Jeanson has bumped into, because last week, as you may recall, Jeanson was in the position of having to flush down the toilet the data that actually confirms the traditional Hebrew priesthood dating. And all of that goes out the window if he pulls all of those radiocarbon dates down way farther and has that haplotype coming on the scene in the post-Christian period, which is what he tried to do. And it's just an absolute ironic mess that, as a historian, this is something that just jumps right out at me, because everything is an interlocking network. If you decide to arbitrarily move the Civil War down and everything associated with it, or worse, try to do it as a unit and just lift the Civil War up and drop it down into the 1920s, now you've got a terrible problem as to all the stuff that connects up with that. And it's probably not a surprise to realize how bad creationists are at history. I noticed this when I was first starting out the TIP project. back in the 1990s, and I was dealing with the material that Philip Jeanson was coming out from the intelligent design movement, because he brought up historical subjects in relation to the early church. In fact, all of this, you can find that in the "Because the Bible Tells Me So" chapter, my old tip thing. Yeah. Oh, yes. That's another little wonderful bit about metallurgy, because those are all telltale indicators of the progress of society, and techniques that are developed and that start spreading around, and trading networks. That's another factor that comes into play, as you can find out in the case of a particular kind of a material, or particular kind of stone that must come from a certain area. That's the whole bit with working out how Stonehenge was built, because the stones from sections of the Stonehenge thing come from Wales, and they were literally an entire completed stone ring was packed up and carted off to the Stonehenge site. This is before the final stages of Stonehenge. That's the blue circles, blue stones, I think, are the items involved. And they repositioned them. Probably it wasn't a matter of them coming in as a conqueror and just walking off with them. It's very possible that there were cultural shifts and migrations, and that there was a big ceremonial thing of moving this material down to Salisbury Plain as a cultural center that related to networking of religious viewpoints that we don't know anything about from a textual point of view, because they didn't have any written language, so they're not telling us about it. Okay, finish paperwork before bed. Yes. Important work. Always leave the old RJ as an appendage to get to when convenient. That's what the whole point of the video thing is. So one of the areas that we'll certainly be alluding to in more detail in the human evolution chapter in the new book, volume 2 of the Rocks Are There, has to do with all that archaeological material, the development of fire, the development of certain kind of tools and trading networks. There's been an enormous amount of work, both in relation to our species, the Homo sapiens ends of it, but also Homo erectus and Neanderthals and others, and the development of the arts and symbolic behavior and all of that, which 20, 30, 40 years ago, it seemed much more like an abrupt Big Bang. And it's even occasionally referred to as such. As the data continues to accumulate, it looks like complex cognitive behavior is spreading out over a much longer time frame, and regions. And so it's not like a light switch is flipped on, that things are coming up with ideas, and then they're gradually spreading around from other areas, and other people may come up with them independently. And all of that's taking place in a period 30, 40, 50, 60,000, 70, 80, 90,000 years ago, which, by the way, is still a long time after the origin of our species. And so it's still an interesting question as to why that attenuation. In other words, anatomically modern humans are predating the kind of attributes that we normally associate with them in terms of artistic endeavors, by a long shot. And you have to ask why. And so I think my suspicion is that it's boiling down not to some light switch going off in our cognitive architecture, but the effects of cultural bits where innovations are occurring in an isolated framework, because you don't have the kind of rapid communication that's going on in much later societies. Rapid communication either in terms of written material or trading networks, or conquerors coming in and interacting with societies and speeding up the process. So long as you have small populations dispersed over a wide area, you have much more attenuated and slow transfer of information. And that's independent of how uniform or not their language systems are, which again is software that we can't tell, because nobody was writing anything down, and we don't have any little microphones stuck in the middle of the past to be able to document what people were saying. So we still can't be sure, although I would be gobsmacked if this weren't the case, that Neanderthals had a fairly sophisticated language, and indeed probably language is developing well along the line in Homo erectus and way into that node going back even into the Australopithecines as to where we're getting our cognitive architecture that's relating to language, which is connected also to gesturing. It's another side issue. So there's a lot of stuff to go on with. And what really strikes me about the creationist literature, and we can include old earth creationist and intelligent design in this as well, because they all suffer from the same problem, is how amazingly disconnected they are from the cognitive literature. They allude to it, oh, language is a miracle, must be by God, boop, and that's about as far as it goes. And Noam Chomsky gets mentioned every once in a while as an authority figure from the evolutionary community. So there's a bunch of tropes, but it really doesn't go much farther than that. And that's why of the science disciplines that I'm tracking, how much of the science data there are in my data field versus how little of it gets mentioned by the creationist thing, the cognitive literature area is one of the worst offenders for just not dealing with it much at all. And it's a burgeoning field, especially in the last 15 or 20 years, as we've gotten vastly improved tools as to be able to do things about what's going on inside the brain. And none of that, of course, is being participated in by the creationist mindset. Because from that point of view, they're really too committed to the magic spirit doing something somehow or other in the brain. And any attempt, if they think trying to reconcile the archaeological record or the geological record is a mess, let them try to deal with the cognitive literature and how the material that we know about how our brain functions, that's what our mind is. It's what the brain does. And everything about that has confirmed that. So that's an interesting little sidebar that we'll only be able to touch on it peripherally, frankly, in Rocks 2, because it is a gigantic topic. It may be an area that we'll tackle in a more complicated way, more in-depth way, in relation to the evolution of religion book and the nature of mind and all of that. It'll come up there. And the possibility that the evolutionary book on the origin and development of religion and the impacts of it will be more than 2 volumes. I've got a gigantic amount of material available, and Jackson and I are pretty committed to doing something that will be relating to all the different religions of the world, not just mind-numbingly obsessing about the Judeo-Christian niche, which is what would be coming up in the traditional creationist context. But all those kids get to play too, Hindus and Native American cultures and religions, and the interesting topic of what the heck was going on in our minds in that period prior to the structured, organized religions that are associated with larger settled agricultural communities and empires. And so that's a absolutely fascinating thing. It's why Göbekli Tepe is so interesting, because it's one of the earliest examples of clearly symbolic, settled shrines. It would be unbelievable if this doesn't have some totemic and religious associations, but we have to speculate on what those might be because we don't have any written records to be able to deal with it. So that covers all of that material. We got a good half an hour on the show in, and the signal is just wonderful. I may at some time reposition downloading the little video things. Matter of fact, since I'm on the ball here, let me see whether or not, I think I did download that little old video file. Let me see if I've still got it popped up in here. That's since I'm able to maneuver around in here, that's the arch. There's the rocks for there. Let's see if I can manage to call that up. And whoops, I'm trying to load my little, come on. Okay, now let me see if I can put up my little commercial here. Share screen. Oops, trying to find the, no, it's not showing up. Let's try that one. Since I got a little bit, there it's now it's showing up. There we see. Now, the other issue is, will it show up? Will the sound pop up or not? We'll have to find that out. Okay. And pardon for the inefficiency. Okay. Oh, come on. And we'll let that run. Yay. Okie doke. And we'll see how well that worked. I don't know whether or not. Oh, sound was playing. Yay! Hi, Gregory. Yes, that was. And I also have we'll hopefully then also try the opening intro thing again now that I can do screen saving. What a difference it makes to have that more reliable thing. And the fact that it's directly connected by Ethernet to the laptop makes it way easier to fiddle on. So hopefully then next week, then we'll start off with our razzle dazzle steampunky opening sequence, and then I'll end each show with the video bit, because I'll be able to get on to that because the connection will be so much better, and obviously the screen sharing and that works adequately in that, because I've already got them on the laptop. It was just a matter of opening them up, but it was just panic stricken in before with that older Wi-Fi connection that was much too sporadic, and if I was bumping up the limits of my data bit, now that we're on unlimited data, it's apparently working out so much better. So there we go. That will be kind of doing us up then for the week this bit. I'll give you a little heads up about some of the stuff that I've been doing in relation to my source field housekeeping work in relation to my big master spreadsheet that I do on the TIP project. As I'm adding in source material, I'm doing searches because there's just a colossal amount of PDFs that I had in the pending category, because I was at a time when I didn't have enough stuff for ink and other material, and some of the stuff that I would be pushing to the side for adding on later into the reference bibliography when I have the time, because it's typically in the project, hundreds of sources every week are coming into the data field, from creationist literature and the technical papers they're citing, and actual technical papers that I'm encountering on my own that relate to the various topics that are discussed, and then the sidebars on all the material on the religious matter and apologetics in that area, and historical material. There's an awful lot of stuff going on. And so what I can do, it takes a little bit, but as I move through each zone in the spreadsheet and add in these newer sources, then I can do some searches through both the current files and the pending files and find out which ones are already in the reference bibliography and put little listings. So now when I'm gradually building up a data field where in my spreadsheet, I'll be able to see whether or not I've got a PDF on it, or if it's a text file in a doc file, I'll have the title on it, and so I can locate all of that. That was a matter of housekeeping that I didn't deal with as much as I should have if I'd known what I was going to be dealing with later on as to how I was going to keep track of all the source material. But since we've got 70,000 sources in the reference bibliography now and constantly growing, that data management thing has just been a mess. And this way, still, it also means that I don't necessarily have to go through. I've still got big piles of technical literature that need to be plugged into the system, but they're lower priority material. Some of it's older historical material that I'd accumulated in the 2008, 9, and 10 period, and then other stacks that are the stuff that's coming in more recently. I try to triage everything so that the material that's relating to the actual current books or pending books are the ones that I really make a point of putting into the system so that they're available and I can access them as easily as possible for the various topics. And then another factor that adds to the complexity is a lot of, particularly in relation to creationist apologetics, they often bring up a bunch of different things at a time. So even in the cosmology chapter, for example, a particular creationist paper may be relevant in bringing up the issue of the second law of thermodynamics, and then also in relation to a discussion of the rings of Saturn, and also on the Big Bang, and also on 2 or 3 other subjects that could be popping up, and it needs to be alluded to along the whole range of stuff, and multiply that by tens and dozens of sources and all that stuff. One thing that did come about, ironically, as a little sidebar of this video that Erica had done, relates to the source for the second law of thermodynamics argument of Henry Morris, which he did not originate that argument. Turns out it's from a British creationist, Clarke, who came up peripherally in a creationist video on that Nazism issue. As I was diving into the material, it was somebody that Erica wasn't familiar with. He was just name dropped. She discovered that he was an evangelical who was alluding to Darwin in a book, which turns out to be a much older book. It was actually 1948. And fortunately, Ronald Numbers, the classic work on creationists, had quite a lot of material on him. He was associated with the British evolution protest movement, which were a bunch of very conservative folk back in the 1920s and 30s. Clarke is not a full-out young Earth creationist, though, because he was not terribly impressed with George McCready Price and the flood geology that was coming out of the Adventists during that period. So what you've got is this thermodynamic argument he's bringing up in basically origins or bust mode, and then it's being grafted onto the young Earth creationist paradigm by Henry Morris in the 60s and 70s. And so we'll be alluding to all of that in Rocks too. So that covers a lot of turf. There's a lot of material going on there, and we do want to make sure that both volumes of the work function very nicely as historical compendium as well as a discussion of the current technical issues, because there's an awful lot about the history of some of these things that gets lost in the shuffle, and it's particularly relevant for people who are in the field of criticizing creationists to be as aware of that background as possible, because I guarantee you the vast majority of creationists don't know the backgrounds. They don't know the history of their own discipline. And there's an enormous amount of historical revisionism where, for example, the racism that was known among Henry Morris's generation as Southern anti-evolutionists, that gets just dusted under the rug. And in fact, the association between flood geology and the Seventh-day Adventists is another thing that they're denying. And so it's tidying up the historical record, at least for their in-house apologetics. But outside of that, of course, is quite a different matter. So that'll get you a little bit of up to speed on things. And we're kind of oscillating around here. You can see I got my haircut from the mange that I had last week. This is a lot cooler to fiddle with. Our temperatures have kind of roll around. We were having big rainstorms just a couple days ago, and now we're be sliding back into the pushing close to 90 degrees again. So it's been roller coastery up and down, but yeah, it's been a lot nicer than in areas where there are terrible floods or the killer heat wave that's kicking in Texas. And then all the spots in the East Coast that's getting all the flame, the smoke from the Canadian fires. We had some bad stuff here from Canadian and also California and Oregon fires over the last couple of years. But judging from the camera shots of what New York's haze looked like, nothing here as serious. In fact, I think Seattle and areas in California and San Francisco and that had vastly worse than we were getting up here in Spokane. So we can count ourselves rather lucky on that, especially since we are quite a temperature inversion bowl down in these volcanic valleys that the city is built in. So it does tend to magnify stuff, but there's enough winds and things that have kept us pretty well insulated from that. Not so much in the East Coast where there's the wind prevailing, things can make quite miserable for them. So anyway, that's the weather report from here. Remember, do not accept any wooden penguins. I do not. I'm very firm on that. And I've counted myself the luckier for it. See you all next week, kids. And ending